Hello, everyone. Welcome to Sunday morning musings with me, Ishka. Um, I'm not doing my Sunday mornings from bed this morning because I've got a big question to grapple with. So I thought, let's get up, let's get it, get some cards out and do it properly. So a few days ago, I was doing a reading for somebody and they asked me a question that I'd never been asked before. And I'd always just assumed the answer because I knew it energetically. I knew it spiritually, but we've never discussed it. So it seemed a brilliant time to talk about, is Avalon real? So there's many different answers to that. Um, Lots of nuances. So we're going to start off with where Avalon is first referenced. And Avalon, as we know it, as the island of women, where Excalibur was forged, where Morgana takes Arthur's body to be healed. It first turns up in the French Romantic writing of Geoffrey of Monmouth and people like that. Writing the Arthurian chivalric legends that we know and love, which are mostly how the vast majority of people have come into contact with the legend of King Arthur. However, Arthur is mentioned in the Welsh triads. Um, he's also there's stories of him of Culhwch and Olwen. There's a reference to him, some warrior being no Arthur, that sort of thing. Pliny the Elder, I believe, rather than Pliny the Younger, the Roman writer, did talk about a mystical island, and we will address that because I think it's Avalon. So I'm just going to read you um, the the epidemiology of the name Avalon quickly. So Avalon first appeared in Geoffrey of Monmouth's 1136 Historia Regum Britannicae, so the history of British kings. And in there, he lists it as the magical place where Excalibur was forged. Now, remember, Excalibur is not the same sword as the sword in the stone. Excalibur was known in the Welsh text as Caliburn, and there's a Welsh name that I won't even attempt to pronounce, but the anglicized version is Caliburn, and it is not the same sword as the sword in the stone legend. Okay, so we just need to establish that Excalibur was a gift from the Lady of the Lake. So we've already got a link to Avalon from the Bronze Age onward way of revering deities by gifting your sword once you had finished using it, or of a dead warrior, to the water. Very well established Brythonic worship of the head, which was often submerged in water. Ponds, lakes, rivers, streams were revered as a place where you could be at one with God. And then there were spirits in the water, almost like a literal veil. So swords were put into, and there's some argument to suggest that perhaps Excalibur, or Caliburn as we know him, was one of these swords that was resurrected by the Lady of the Lake, who could well have been a well maiden or a priestess of the water and given to Arthur to use. There's archaeological similarities um, between what the story is echoing, it coming from water, being gifted by a sacred woman of the water, to what we understand was historical practice in the UK. Although taking the sword from the water is somewhat controversial, obviously, had it been an offering to the gods. But there is historical um, reference there for that to be a plausible thing to have happened. Although it says it was made there and forged. Um, and later, obviously, Arthur was taken there to recover by Morgana. Um, so the name Avalon, um, now there's much debate over that, but um, Geoffrey of Monmouth refers to it as Insula Avalonis, which means the Isle of Avalon. Um, and later on in his Vita Merlini, The Life of Merlin, which he wrote 14 years after, he calls it Insula Pomarum, which is the island of fruit trees. And many of you will know the word pomme is apple in French. So not just fruit trees, but specifically apple trees. Today, the name is generally considered by actually epidemiologists as being from the Welsh word Avalon, which literally means apple tree. And also the Proto-Celtic Albania, which means fruit-bearing thing, or Cornish or Breton, which obviously is, along with Welsh, the only remnants of Bretonique spoken by the Celts that we have. The word is Abel or Aphelen, which again means apple island or apple. So there's also Irish legends of the other world in old Irish legends, and it refers to the Isle of Man specifically having apple trees. However, I would say that Somerset, for hundreds and hundreds of years, is renowned specifically as being where the nation's apples are grown in the UK. Now, the climate in the time when Arthur lived, and the Arthur as we understand it, Arthur MacAden, in the 6th century AD, was warmer. The early medieval period, the Dark Ages and early medieval period, the climate was warmer in the UK, so it is arguable that apples will have happily grown elsewhere, and they do. However, the history of Somerset, where Glastonbury and Avalon is understood to be, is well established as being the home of apples. Yes, Kentish people, before you start saying the garden of Britain is Kent. Yes, and yes, you did grow apples, but you're always, it's much more known for being providing all sorts of different food. Whereas Somerset, where Glastonbury is, where we understand Avalon to be, is very specifically associated with apples. Now, in the early 12th century, William of Malmesbury claimed that the name Avalon came from a man called Avaloch. Where he got this from, we do not know, who once lived on the isle with his daughters. Gerald of Wales also derives the name Avalon from a former ruler called Avalo. Now, they could have been copying each other's work. However, Pliny the Elder, again, that trusty Roman scholar, um, refers to Avalus in his first century writing Naturalis Historia as a mysterious island where amber could be found in Britain. And that's very interesting because you think, well, amber's found at the seaside, isn't it? It washes up. But remember that Glastonbury was underwater and Glastonbury Tor was an island. So there is historic archaeology, historic precedent that what we understand to be the Isle of Avalon in Glastonbury was only accessible by water until the monks came in the medieval period and drained the land there in order to farm it. Now, with the specific reference to this Avalus magic island mentioned in Roman writing, being specifically where amber could be found, this is not just because it was an island waterway, which some arguments could say was a salt marsh because the River Severn and Frome flooded massively inland from the sea. There's even historic precedents of tsunamis affecting Somerset and the Avon Valley and this sort of thing. But when archaeologists were excavating in Cheddar, which is extremely near geographically to Glastonbury, they found a large piece of amber in the Paleolithic level of Goth's Cave in Cheddar Gorge. Now, there's only been a little bit of examination carried out on this piece of amber. It's generally believed to be Baltic amber, so it would have washed up. It would have potentially washed up. However, if there's Paleolithic peoples collecting amber and bringing it inland in Somerset, it's not a wild stretch of the imagination to say that they were also doing that in other parts of Somerset near to Cheddar, and perhaps, Glastonbury Tor, that hill we know as Glastonbury Tor, that we know as Avalon, was another place where pieces of amber were discovered historically. The hill did have tunnels in, whether they were ancient or, Victorians carried out excavations, whether they were existing. There's some evidence to suggest that there was some existing cave networks under the Tor. And so, it's not a stretch of the imagination to consider that perhaps Paleolithic people were leaving amber beads there. But then we also have to talk about the nature of the culture during Arthurian times, as to why there might be amber in Avalon at Glastonbury, and therefore why it makes Glastonbury a good contender for being the Isle of Avalon. And this also brings us to the link to Morgana Le Fay. Morgana was a real person. Arthur MacAden, from one of the princelings of Dalryter, which is up in modern day Strathclyde, which was a kingdom of the Old North Alliances, he had a sister called Morgan, and her name in itself hints at the type of culture that you were dealing with. Morgan means seaborn. You're talking about a culture of people who were so comfortable with seafaring, some of their children were born there. Um, it's like a car journey to us nowadays. Um, because with Morgan's association with Avalon, with Glastonbury, with this being this magical Isle of Women, of her preserve, really, of her kingdom. Morgana, the real life Morgana, was married to King Lot of Lothian. There's lots of archaeology and writings that you can follow that arguably would place Lot in modern day Lothian, potentially in uh, Leith, which is just outside Edinburgh, a suburb of Edinburgh now. This is on the River Forth. And that's also a link to Avalon because there's some arguments to say that the islands in the Forth may be Avalon, to do with their proximity to where Morgan lived. However, my argument against that is that these were a seafaring people. If you say, how could a prince of Scotland, of a Scottish clan, before Scotland in its existed, how could a queen of Edinburgh, a place near Edinburgh, have a base in Somerset? How could King Arthur be associated with Tintagel? Um, and how could he have fought battles in the south of Wales in the Preseli Hills where he lost his son Loki? How is that possible? Because when we think of that now, if you tried to get on horseback from southern Scotland to Somerset and Cornwall, it would take you an age. You would have to change horses multiple times or stop and rest them for days at a time. I mean, you're talking about, impractically ridiculous journeys. But we're thinking about it all wrong. And this is what makes Avalon not only real, but also Glastonbury the most likely place, is because we're thinking about it all wrong. They didn't travel on land. They didn't take their horses on land. They didn't move standing stones on land. Even in the Neolithic and Bronze Age, there are boats where archaeologically that have sank off the coast of Wales, where they in the Avon estuary, where they are finding standing stones on boats. These are seafaring people, and not just seafaring people for long journeys. They were whizzing up and down the Irish Sea and the deep enough inland waterways, like we would hop in a car and drive to the shops. You know, if you understand that the Irish Sea was the superhighway of the post-Roman, well, arguably before the Romans, but certainly in the time we're talking about, where we consider Arthur to have lived in the 6th century, you're talking about people who used the Irish Sea like a superhighway. They had boats with names. Arthur had a very famous boat with that was named, even as we name ships nowadays. This is long established. They had their children at sea, Morgana. And so to have kings and queens associated with lands in Scotland, then having links to Cornwall and Wales and Somerset is not a massive stretch of the imagination. I think it is for us now because we think, well, God, that's miles away. But to them, it wasn't. It was a day or two sail. This is not, and these are people who were very adept at sailing. Arthur's grandparents, Gabran, Macfergus, you know, he was the son of Fergus More. Fergus More was an Irish king who had invaded the west coast of Scotland and established the kingdom of Dalrieta. These are people who were there because of seafaring. This is how they lived. And even up until, the 16th century, Irish kings and queens Irish rulers were still ruling the sea. The most famous of which is Grenouilla, who famously had a meeting with her counterpart Elizabeth I in London. She was the last seafaring Irish queen, and she was still living as her ancestors would have lived. And, they knew the seas, they knew the weather like the back of their hand. They could look at the horizon and tell you what the weather was going to be like in a few days' time, whether to sail, not to sail. They had armadas of ships. And so it's a very, very easy to make the link between the west coast of Scotland, although Morgana was on the Pictish side, on the east coast, but still on the coasts of Scotland, coming all the way down to Wales and to Somerset and Cornwall. So this doesn't rule out Glastonbury as being the Isle of Avalon because of distance at all. In fact, it being on the southwest area makes it even more likely. And so this is how we also have the link to Tintagel Castle with Merlin and Arthur. The real life Arthur MacAden, his cousin Constantine was a ruler of Cornwall. His mother Igraine was famously a queen of Cornwall. And we know from excavations at Tintagel that they were importing silks from all over the world. So it wasn't just that they were whizzing up and down the Irish Sea. They were also receiving exports and imports from North Africa, from the Mediterranean. There were ships from all over the world coming in to this part of Britain at this time. And so we can't discount Glastonbury as Avalon due to logistics and geographical location at all, especially as it was surrounded by water. The churches and the abbey on Glastonbury Tor and in Glastonbury also lend credence to it being a sacred site. There was a deliberate policy in the medieval times of building churches. I think there was a law passed, I think in the I want to say the late 15th century, but I might be wrong. Actively encouraging churches to be built on sacred sites in Britain. And that is why we end up with places like Old Sarum, which is a hill, a stone circle, then a hill fort, then a Roman city, then it's got a church whacked in the middle of it. You have, like the Romans before them, an active attempt by the authorities, this time the church authorities, to commandeer sacred sites, not just to stop the locals continuing to worship at them and venerate them, but also to give themselves legitimacy by putting themselves on the sacred sites. So the fact that there is an abbey established in Glastonbury, and there is a church built on top of the Tor, which we understand to be the Isle of Avalon. It gives further credence to the fact that this was a sacred site. Also, the energetic sightings. So you may have seen the Modern Fairy Sightings podcast with Jo Hickey Hall, where she talks to people who have seen the Dark Man of the Tor, which is a very famous manifestation of Gwyn ap Nuith and Gwion, who we know to be Taliesin, who manifest themselves up in the tower of Glastonbury Tor, usually in the early hours of the morning. Sometimes when people are at Glastonbury Tor in the day, they hear people talking in the tower. Sometimes Gwyn likes to give a little shout and give people a shock because he thinks it's funny on Glastonbury Tor. However, we know from the Welsh writings I think it's in the Black Book of Carmarthen, I can't remember, it might be in the Mabinogion actually, the story Culhwch and Olwen, when Gwyn ap Nuith comes to Arthur's assistance to help him help them win the hand of Olwen, the giant's daughter. And as a side quest, Gwyn decides to make off with Craethalath, who he is in love with, who Arthur is betrothed to someone else. I call him Guthria. I think the Welsh translation is Guhira. But Gwyn makes off with his fiancée Craethalath and abducts her and takes her back to his fort in Annwn, which we know to be Anglesey, we believe to be Anglesey Island, and because he was in love with her. And Arthur sort of condemns his punishment for Gwyn, and to a certain extent, Thea is for them to fight to the end of time. On the 1st of May, and then on the end of time, whoever wins gets the hand of Craethalath. But the fact that Gwyn manifests in his dark man form, in his cursed form, his lower vibrational form, on Glastonbury Tor, to me, lends further credence that this is Avalon, because this is an Arthurian legend, an Arthurian curse, and he's manifesting in an Arthurian place. To me, that gives further credence to it genuinely being the Isle of Avalon. And then you've got the link to it being the Isle of Women, the domain of Morgan and her priestesses. Now, the story of Morgan Le Fay, and from my channelings of her as well, she was said to have been training as a druid. And this wasn't unusual at all. Actually, I think it's Pliny the Elder again, actually, wrote that when he wrote of the Roman invasion of Britain, it might have even been the first Roman invasion of Britain of Caesar rather than Augustus, that he had to withdraw. There was one initial wave of Roman invasion of Britain. They didn't get very far. They realized it was going to take more manpower, and they withdrew again. And then his successor Augustus came back and completed the job. I think it was in Caesar's invasion, but I might be wrong. They decided that the druidic classes were too powerful, held too much sway in Britain. If they wanted to win over hearts and minds, they needed to get rid of them all. So they sailed around to Anglesey, where that part of Wales where the Druids were based. It was kind of their spiritual center, which is interesting because we associate that with Annwn and with Gwyn as well, which again was the underworld, the spiritual center, and they they tried to kill them all basically. But Pliny the Elder's account of the Romans approaching the coast of Anglesey to wipe out the center, the stronghold of Druidic power in Britain, talks about the Romans seeing, so they're still at sea. It talks about them seeing women in black cloaks, so of the Druidic order, whether they were acolytes, but women. And when I see Druidic women in energetically in standing stones, they're wearing black cloaks as well. So for me, that's definitely Druidic women. And you know, I don't think they're acolytes. You know, these are people who are, you know, have made their way up. They are trained. You had to train for 18 years. 18 to 20 years to qualify as a fully trained druid. You know, this was a life's work historically. The Romans saw these women specifically lining the coast of the island in their black cloaks, screaming curses and, you know, trying to frighten away the Romans. You know, I don't think they talk about them having weapons. They're literally using their energy, using their voices, powerful women to deter the Roman army, you know. So there is historical reference to women druids being comparable to male druids. It wasn't a specific gender role. And Morgana very famously began her training as a druid, and that was her cause. That's what she wanted to do. So she had this knowledge. Famously, she was stopped from finishing her learning and married off in a political allegiance. And this is one of the things that caused so much resentment in Morgana that ended up ultimately with Arthur's death at the Battle of Camlan at her son's hands. And then her remorse and taking his body, Arthur's body, and looking after him, because, you know, these were the things that sowed the seeds of the whole Arthurian story. So the Isle of Avalon being the Isle of Women, absolutely. If Morgana is already quite high up in the Druidic order, she would then have her own acolytes and be training women. And still to this day, the Red Spring specifically in Glastonbury, in Avalon, is used to complete in a spiritually symbolic way the training of the priestesses of the goddess order, of the priestesses of the moon, lots of different orders of modern day priestesses in Avalon. And so there's this link all through time of it being a center of female, it was specifically Glastonbury, a center of female spirituality. There's the Red and the White Spring. The red in the Middle Ages became associated with the blood of Christ because it was infused with iron, and so it was blood-like because it's a darker color. Actually, let's compare it. And there's the White Spring. Hang on, I'm going to compare it. So this is water from the Red Spring in Glastonbury. And this is water. Let me hold it so you can see it against something white. don't know. Let me find out. I haven't got anything white. But you can see it has a slightly yellowy orange tinge. And this is from the bit that's kind of that you're allowed to collect it from. So I should imagine the unfiltered stuff was a lot more orange. And this is the water from the white spring, and you can see it's a lot clearer. So the white spring water comes out like this because it comes through calcite. So you can see that there is a marked difference in colour as well. And so you have the masculine and feminine, but you have this sort of blood-like water. But obviously, that in itself lends it to being associated with women because of menstrual blood. And so there's historical precedence for it being associated with women in Glastonbury. And this also adds credence to it being Avalon, because Avalon is referred to the Isle of Women, the place where the ladies of the lake were trained. This all, effectively the ladies of the lake were what we understand to be well maidens. Geoffrey of Monmouth has made them into these creatures that lived in the water that weren't mythical, but historically they were well maidens or priestesses of the water. There's archaeological evidence for that. So it's just that Geoffrey of Monmouth has taken things that were happening in the UK and fantasticalized them, but they were happening. And in a way, it's done a disservice to Glastonbury as being the Isle of Avalon, because it's taken away, it's mythologized the archaeology, and so in a way people poo-poo the fact that it could be Avalon, but I absolutely believe that it is. Morgana's presence is so strong there. So that's my argument for Avalon being real historically, and also it being Glastonbury. However, we need to talk about how Geoffrey of Monmouth and his writings have in fact made Avalon more real. So we were talking the other day when Gwyn ap Nuith was with us, talking about gods and deities and the differences. And we got onto something called egregores. Now, egregores are energetic entities that are made by our own beliefs. Now, because Geoffrey of Monmouth has effectively created an Arthurian cult, the amount of people who believe in King Arthur and his knights and the Round Table and Avalon and the whole story, because of the legend that sprung up from Geoffrey of Monmouth's writings, that level of belief, and us reading bedtime stories to our children of Arthurian legend, all that sort of thing, we have given our energy to the legend, and that in itself creates an egregore. So even if everything I've just said is complete nonsense and Avalon did not exist historically, the fact that we read our stories to our children and we make films of it and we believe in Avalon due to Geoffrey of Monmouth's Arthurian legends, means it's real because it's an egregore. Now, I would argue that historically and archaeologically it's a real place. We've got us reading stories about it and believing in it, so that's feeding into it. So it's almost like what Gwyn was talking about, that it's an egregore that's overlaid a real place. And made it even more powerful. Um, and that gets me onto how Avalon also exists in a third way, not just in the historical record, not just through our energetic creation, through our beliefs, but also through pilgrimage. And so the physical act, you'll remember me talking about song lines in Aboriginal culture, the deer trods in kind of proto and Indo-European culture and in British culture, the physical act of walking and talking and singing certain lines energetically validates them and brings them back alive. So the physical act of undertaking pilgrimage to the Isle of Avalon, to the Glastonbury that we understand to be the Isle of Avalon, um, in itself keeps it alive and makes it in a third way real. Um, and lots of people would argue that Glastonbury's gone downhill. It's not how it used to be. You know, there's all sorts of ne'er-do-wells now, or people exploiting it commercially and that sort of thing. And I would say to them that the commercialization of Avalon as Glastonbury, as the Isle of Avalon, started with the church. It started with the building of that abbey in Glastonbury. It started with uh, the Holy Thorn legend, and saying the red spring was the blood of Christ. It's Joseph of Arimathea, that's it. He went there, didn't he? I was trying to think of the name. It started with the building of churches on sacred sites. It started with the monks in the abbey getting a bit desperate for cash, so they dug up a couple of bodies and said, "Oh yeah, this is Arthur and Guinevere." Do you know what I mean? Yeah. It may or may not be. I don't know. We need to DNA test it, don't we? Are they Irish? Maybe then. Um, and so I think it's one of those things that we always look back more fondly on the past and think, you know, it's not how it used to be in my day. But actually, the commercialization of Avalon started in, uh, the Middle Ages and medieval times, and has just continued. I'm pretty sure that Glastonbury Festival, which is actually not in Glastonbury, is in Pilton down the road, is called Glastonbury to attract people to it because Glastonbury is Avalon, and so that was started in the 60s, the 70s, 60s. Glastonbury is no more commercialized than it has ever been. Um, so I wouldn't say it's exploitation of Avalon. I think it's just the way it is, and it's up to your own discernment to work out where the sacred places are and they are not. I know, to me, my favourite place in Glastonbury, apart from the tour, obviously, um, is the White Spring, which is the least commercial place. It's run by volunteers. Um, they don't sell anything there anymore. There used to be shops, there used to be stalls in there, but there's not anymore. It's the least commercial. It's free to get in, although you can donate. Compare that to the Red Spring, where it's fully commercialized. You pay to get in, they make their own bottles. These bottles are sold so you can collect the water. They don't miss a trick, and it's still a sacred place, but money has to be made to maintain it. And so with regards to Avalon, being now full of ne'er-do-wells and people who've gone there who are down on their luck and have stayed, and there's tramps and there's homeless people, and there's a sort of homeless camp of people without houses. We're seeing people with caravans queuing up down the road and that sort of thing. I would argue that's been going on for ages. I remember, when I was a teenager going with my friends who were travelers and us just parking up wherever and hitching there. And, that's gone on forever and a day. But it reminds me when people moan about Avalon, Glastonbury being down on its heel, um, it reminds me of two things. It reminds me of what Jesus said about dining with the Pharisee, where he said, those that are well are not in need of a physician, but those that are sick are. And so I would argue that people coming to Glastonbury that are perhaps struggling mentally or unwell or down on their luck, don't have a home, who don't have any money, who perhaps have addictions, what better place to come than a sacred meeting place, And people in Glastonbury, people in Avalon, they talk to each other. If you sit outside the White Spring on a sunny afternoon, you chat to anyone about anything, you'll meet all sorts of people. I would say perhaps you would meet there people who would say something to you that would change your life, or offer you an opportunity, or run into someone that changes the course and the direction of your life. And this brings me on to the second thing that reminds me of with regards to Avalon, and that's Stonehenge. The archaeological digs at Stonehenge and the surrounding areas, the burial mounds, the ditches that have got bodies in them, don't come to me with this nonsense of there was sacrifices and what that, that's just no. If you're gonna post that sort of thing, don't bother. Not at all. However, there is evidence of people coming from mainland Europe. I know that bodies from sort of the Switzerland-Germany border, places like that, have been found in close proximity to the Stonehenge circle, and signs of encampments nearby, cooking, and what archaeologists have surmised is that people were traveling from mainland Europe to make a pilgrimage to Stonehenge throughout history, not just when it was first built, but throughout history. And some of those bones of those people that came showed signs of really very serious injury or disease. And perhaps they came to be healed. And I would argue that those people who come to Avalon now, who are, unwell, addicted, down on their heel, are perhaps just doing something that we've done for thousands of years, and that is go to somewhere that is sacred, whether consciously or unconsciously. They are drawn there to change something within themselves. And that's my belief of why Avalon holds such a draw. Perhaps even, people are drawn by past life energy. I was drawn to the White Spring in Glastonbury years and years and years, decades before I met Gwyn ap Nuith, or before I even knew his legend or who he was, decades before I ever was, contacted by Morgana. So I think There's something within us that draws us to these places for some other reason, for our soul path. And who are we to moan about, the sorts of people that visit certain places? So that's my two penneth worth about it. Um, the other thing that I was going to say about the links to Avalon and Arthurian legend, which I've totally forgotten, just from the beginning, um, is the link to knights and chivalry of Geoffrey of Monmouth and the real Arthur's culture. Um, the King Arthur that we know and love from childhood is a knight in shining armor, and his chivalric, honor bound group of knights. And for someone who's interested in archaeology and history, it it kind of gives me the twitches, because knights in shining armor didn't exist in the time we know Arthur Mackayden to have lived. The word knight didn't exist. The word knight didn't really start to be used until on or maybe just after Arthur's time, between the 6th and 9th centuries. And actually, it was the Anglo-Saxons, so the people who came into Britain after Arthur's people lived, the people actually that Arthur and his allegiance of allies, Urien of Raiged, the kings of Outclut, the kings of Northumbria at the time, before they were defeated by the Anglo-Saxons, they were all banded together in order to fight the Anglo-Saxons. So it's ironic that the Anglo-Saxons ceded the very name that of horseback rider that they would come to be associated with. And on the chess pieces that were found in the Scottish Islands, I think were Viking. They've got their very first likenesses of warriors on horsebacks. And the Anglo-Saxons began to call them knichts, which literally meant horseback rider, horseback warrior. And that obviously, we ended up making the K silent, and instead of knichts, it became nichts, knights, And that's why we still have a K at the beginning of the word. Thank you, Anglo-Saxons. However, in that form, they didn't exist in Arthurian times. And that chivalric honor code is actually medieval. Specifically, and this is when Geoffrey of Monmouth is writing, in the 12th century. This is where the chivalric code comes from. The most famous court for chivalric values was that of Eleanor of Aquitaine in Poitiers, and inspired by the troubadours that were coming. The troubadours were coming from northern Spain, the wandering minstrels and storytellers. They were coming from northern Spain. They were coming into the southern parts of France, and they were bringing with them these romantic stories. There's some arguments to say that came from North Africa, and was influenced by Arabian stories of romances and whatever. And this progressed up into France. And then Eleanor of Aquitaine, very famously, divorced her husband, King Philip of France. She thought Paris stank, she hated it, and she divorced him, and she married Henry of Henry Plantagenet, and they took over the throne of England. And so they brought this chivalric knight's code, poetry, and honor bound, and singing songs to beautiful women about their amazing beauty, and you know, um, saving, women up in towers and all this stuff. They sort of brought this poetic, honor-bound knights culture with them from the Poitiers court and really made it fashionable in Britain. However, if we look at Knights, the most famous Knights before they became knights in shining armor cultures were the Scythians, which there's some argument they were around the Black Sea area, parts of northern Greece. They were arguably genetically, some of them migrated into the north of Europe and became the Vikings. They in turn came down into northern France and became the Norsemans, the Normans, who invaded England. So we've got this horse culture going up round Europe and popping down into Britain, but we've also got the Celtic cultures, the Brythons, who spoke Brythonic, and they are the other most famous, other than, Genghis Khan, but he was quite far away from Britain, so he's kind of a sideline. They were the most famous European horsemen, knights, in history that had a direct impact on British culture. And so Arthur and his culture of horseback warriors, with their honourable host, looking after their own, which we have contemporary accounts of him, Arthur looking after his warriors, and not necessarily being so great to other people. It's the closest that we have historically to the chivalric culture, that honor-bound band of brothers type culture. And you can see that when you read things like the Godolphin, or when you read the writings of Taliesin. The good attributes, the honorable attributes, the appearance, how handsome they were, how youthful, how sprightly, that is almost mirrors chivalric culture. So you can see how Geoffrey of Monmouth very easily overlaid this chivalric, medieval, fashionable way culture over the Brythonic culture, because actually it was a really good match. It wasn't exact. They didn't have armor in that sense. They were kind of still appropriating and Roman helmets and that sort of thing. There was some crossover between Roman armor, what they were wearing in kind of the 6th century. So there was a little bit of armor, but not in the way we understand a knight in shining armor in medieval times. However, I think that 6th century Arthurian knights were a really good match for the chivalric culture, because their host culture was so similar. And so actually, I think Geoffrey of Monmouth's Arthur is not a million miles from the real culture of Arthur. And that is why, although he made a lot of stuff up and embellished the stories and mythologized and made them more magical and this sort of thing. He was basing them on real people. He was basing them on real events, and he was basing them on a culture that was probably the most similar to chivalric culture that we had indigenously in the history of Britain. You know, we were very famous for our horseback riders and our chariot riders, Boudica being a brilliant example, leading from the front, strong women. It's not a huge stretch of the imagination. And that is one of my arguments for Avalon being real and being Glastonbury. I'm going to do a card reading on what the cards say about whether Avalon was real and if it still is. But I'm going to do that as a separate reading because I've been going on for ages. So I'll be back shortly with that in another video. Please like and subscribe. It really helps the channel. And I'll see you again back with the cards.